Tonight, we are going to walk together through the world's longest epic poem, a story that stretches across nearly 200,000 verses and has been whispered from one generation to the next for over 3,000 years. This is the Mahabharata, a tale of a great family torn apart by ambition, bound by duty, and forever changed by a devastating war that shaped the spiritual landscape of ancient India. In the hours ahead, we will uncover the historical secrets hidden within this Hindu epic, explained in the gentlest way possible, perfect for those moments when your mind needs something fascinating but your body needs rest. Before we journey through the shadows of history together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of folklore, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes if you wish, or keep them softly open. We are about to travel back thousands of years to the dusty roads and marble palaces of ancient India, where the air smells of sandalwood and jasmine, where the evening sky turns the colour of ripe mangoes, and where the greatest story ever told first took shape on the tongues of wandering poets. Long before anyone thought to write down the Mahabharata, it existed as sound, pure sound. Words passed from teacher to student in the cool shade of forest ashrams, where the only interruption was the call of peacocks and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. This was how knowledge travelled in ancient India, not through scrolls or tablets, but through the human voice, through memory, through the sacred act of listening. Picture, if you will, a world without paper, without printing presses, without screens. In this world, the most important things a society wanted to remember had to live inside human minds. And so, the poets of ancient India developed extraordinary techniques for memorization. They would chant verses in specific rhythms, in melodic patterns that made the words stick like honey to the walls of memory. A single teacher might spend 40 years mastering the Mahabharata, learning every verse, every nuance, every pause and emphasis, before passing it on to the next generation. The Mahabharata history stretches back to at least 400 BCE, though many scholars believe its roots reach even further into the Bronze Age, perhaps to events that occurred around 900 BCE or earlier. The exact dates remain soft and uncertain, like trying to trace the source of a great river. We know only that the story grew slowly, like a banyan tree extending its branches and dropping new roots into the soil over centuries. The name itself tells us something important. Mahabharata means the great tale of the Bharata dynasty, or more poetically, the great tale of India, for the ancient name of India was Bharatavarsha, the land of the Bharatas. This was not merely entertainment, this was identity. This was the story a civilization told itself about who it was and where it came from. Tradition credits the sage Vyasa as the author of this immense work, but Vyasa is a mysterious figure, more myth than man. His name means the compiler or the arranger, which suggests that he may have been the one who first organized the countless oral traditions into a coherent whole. Legend says that Vyasa was born on a small island in the Yamuna River, the son of a wandering sage and a fisherwoman named Satyavati. He is described as dark-skinned, with matted hair and piercing eyes that seem to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality. According to the ancient accounts, Vyasa composed the Mahabharata in his mind, holding all those verses in perfect arrangement within his consciousness. But the task of writing it down required divine assistance. The story goes that Vyasa approached Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity of wisdom and beginnings, and asked him to serve as scribe. Ganesha agreed, but with one condition. Vyasa must dictate without pause, without hesitation, without a single break in the flow of words. If he stopped, Ganesha would set down his pen and walk away. Vyasa, ever clever, made his own condition in return. Ganesha must not write a single word until he fully understood its meaning. This gave Vyasa time to compose particularly difficult verses, complex passages that would make even a god pause to think. And so, the story was written, with Vyasa speaking into the silence of the cosmos, and Ganesha's hand moving across palm leaves with divine speed. This relaxing history documentary is not just about what happened in the Mahabharata, but also about how the story came to us, carried like a precious flame through the darkness of millennia. Imagine all the unnamed teachers, all the faithful students, all the monsoon nights when verses were recited by lamplight while rain drummed on thatched roofs. Imagine the travelling bards who wandered from village to village, trading stories for meals, keeping the epic alive in the hearts of farmers and kings alike. The oral tradition required more than simple memorization. It required understanding. A truly great reciter of the Mahabharata did not merely repeat words. They inhabited the story. They became the characters. Their voice would rise with excitement during battle scenes and drop to a whisper during moments of tender intimacy. They knew which pauses to hold for dramatic effect and when to quicken their pace to build suspense. In this way, the Mahabharata was never frozen in time. Each generation of storytellers added their own flourishes, their own interpretations, their own local details. A version told in the green valleys of Kashmir might emphasize different elements than one told in the tropical south. The core story remained the same, but the texture shifted and breathed like a living thing. This is why the written Mahabharata we have today is so impossibly vast. It contains not just one story, but hundreds. It holds philosophy and law codes, astronomy and medicine, the duties of kings and the wisdom of sages. It is a library disguised as a poem, an encyclopedia wrapped in the language of myth. Some scholars call it the fifth Veda, placing it alongside the most sacred texts of ancient Indian mythology. Let your eyes grow heavy now as we consider this immensity. 100,000 verses in the shortest recensions, nearly 200,000 in the longest, 7 times the length of the Iliad and Odyssey combined, 20 times longer than the Bible. And all of it, every word, once existed only in the ephemeral medium of human breath and memory. The oldest surviving manuscripts date from around the 11th century CE, but these are copies of copies of copies, links in a chain stretching back into the unknowable past. Scholars have spent lifetimes comparing different versions, trying to reconstruct the original, but the original may be an illusion. There may have never been a single fixed text, only an ever-evolving tradition of telling and retelling. What we can say with certainty is that the Mahabharata history represents one of humanity's greatest achievements of collective memory. It tells us something profound about what ancient people valued. They did not build pyramids or carve their stories into stone. They trusted the human voice. They trusted that if a story was important enough, it would survive. And the Mahabharata did survive, travelling from India to Southeast Asia, influencing the literature and art of Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and beyond. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you are participating in this ancient tradition. You are receiving the story through your ears, just as listeners have for thousands of years. The medium has changed, but the essence remains the same. Someone is speaking, you are listening, and a great tale is unfolding in the darkness between us. The story proper begins, as all great Indian stories do, with a king. But not just any king. We must go back several generations before the main events to understand the tangled roots of the family tree. For the Mahabharata is above all a family story, and like all families, this one carries the weight of its past. Every choice the ancestors made echoes forward through time, setting in motion events that their descendants cannot escape. The setting of this ancient tale deserves our attention as well. The geography of the Mahabharata is not merely backdrop, it is character. The great plains of northern India, watered by sacred rivers, provided the stage upon which this drama unfolded. The Ganges and Yamuna rivers, meeting at the holy confluence of Prayaga, were arteries of civilization, carrying trade and pilgrimage and the prayers of millions. Along their banks rose the great cities of the age, each with its own character, its own traditions, its own place in the cosmic order. The climate of this region shaped the rhythms of life. The scorching summers, when the earth cracked and the cattle sought shade beneath whatever trees they could find, gave way to the monsoon rains that transformed the land into a sea of green. The winters were mild but misty, the mornings cold enough to see one's breath, the afternoons warm and golden. These seasonal cycles determined when wars could be fought, when marriages could be celebrated, when pilgrimages could be undertaken. The people of this era lived close to the land in ways we can barely imagine today. They knew the names of every plant, the habits of every animal, the signs in the sky that predicted weather and fortune. Their religion was not separate from nature, but woven through it. Every river was a goddess. Every mountain was sacred. The very earth they walked upon was the body of a divine mother who sustained all life. The blessed and cursed ancestors. Let us go back now, far back, to a time when the borders between the divine and human worlds were thin and permeable. Gods walked among mortals. Sages possessed powers that could shake the heavens. And the fate of empires could turn on a single glance, a single promise, a single act of kindness or cruelty. There was a king named Shantanu who ruled the ancient kingdom of Hastinapura. Close your eyes and picture this great city rising from the fertile plains near the confluence of sacred rivers. Its walls were made of sun-baked brick, painted white and decorated with images of lions and elephants. Inside, the streets were broad and clean, lined with the homes of merchants and artisans, all leading eventually to the royal palace that crowned the highest ground. The palace of Hastinapura was a marvel of ancient architecture. Its columns were carved from red sandstone, inlaid with precious stones that caught the morning light. The floors were polished so smooth that they reflected the faces of those who walked upon them. Gardens filled with lotus ponds surrounded the main buildings, and the air was always sweet with the fragrance of jasmine and night-blooming flowers. King Shantanu was known for his virtue and his wisdom, but also for a deep melancholy that seemed to live behind his eyes. He had loved once before, you see, loved a goddess. The river Ganges herself had taken human form and become his wife, but she had left him, returning to her true nature as the sacred waters that flow down from the Himalayas, and she had taken most of their children with her, drowning them in her own currents moments after birth. This strange and terrible arrangement requires some explanation. In the realm of the gods there were 8 celestial beings known as the Vasus who had committed an offence against a powerful sage. As punishment, they were cursed to be born as mortals, to experience the suffering and limitation of human existence. The goddess Ganga agreed to be their mother, to give them human birth and then immediately release them through drowning, so that their time in mortal form would be as brief as possible. Shantanu, not knowing any of this, had watched in horror as his wife drowned their children one by one. 7 times he stood by, bound by a promise he had made never to question her actions. But when she moved to drown the 8th child, he could no longer contain himself. He cried out, breaking his vow, and Ganga stopped. She explained everything then, the curse, the Vasus, the agreement that had brought her to him, and then she left, taking the 8th child with her to raise in the celestial realms. Shantanu was left alone with his grief and his empty palace. Only one son remained from that divine union, a boy named Devavrata, who grew to become the greatest warrior of his age. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. His skill with the bow was legendary. His knowledge of scripture was vast. Everyone assumed he would someday inherit his father's throne, but fate had other plans. Fate always has other plans. One evening, King Shantanu went hunting along the banks of the Yamuna River. The sun was setting, painting the water gold and crimson, and a soft mist was rising from the reeds. In that liminal space between day and night, he caught a scent on the wind that stopped him in his tracks. It was the most beautiful fragrance he had ever known, sweeter than sandalwood, more intoxicating than lotus blossoms. He followed the scent like a man in a dream, pushing through the tall grasses until he came upon a young woman standing at the water's edge. Her name was Satyavati, and she was the daughter of the chief of the fishermen who worked this stretch of river. But there was nothing ordinary about her. Her skin was dark and lustrous. Her eyes held the depth of still water. And that fragrance, that impossible fragrance, emanated from her very being, a gift from a sage who had blessed her long ago. The story of how Satyavati came to smell of heavenly perfume is itself worthy of a night's telling. She had been born smelling of fish, as might be expected for the daughter of fisherfolk. But a wandering sage had desired her, and in exchange for her compliance, he he had transformed her odour into something divine. He had also given her back her virginity so that she could marry as if nothing had happened. From this encounter, she had borne a son, the very Vyasa who would later compose the Mahabharata. But this son, dark and strange, had immediately departed for the forest to pursue the life of an ascetic, leaving Satyavati to her father's household. Shantanu fell in love instantly, completely, hopelessly. He asked her to become his queen, but Satyavati's father, a shrewd man who understood the value of what he possessed, made a condition. He would give his daughter to the king only if her sons would inherit the throne. This meant passing over Devavrata, the king's firstborn, the legitimate heir. Shantanu could not bring himself to make such a promise. He returned to his palace in Hastinapura, but his heart remained on the banks of the Yamuna. Days passed, then weeks. The king grew pale and distracted. He stopped attending to matters of state. He barely ate. His courtiers whispered that their ruler was dying of some mysterious illness. It was Devavrata who discovered the truth. When he learned what was troubling his father, he did something extraordinary. He went to Satyavati's father himself and made a vow. Not only would he renounce his own claim to the throne, but he would never marry, never have children, so that there could never be any rival to Satyavati's descendants. This was no small sacrifice. This was everything. In ancient India, to die without children was considered a tragedy of the highest order. A man's legacy lived through his sons. His rituals would be performed by his descendants. To cut off that line was to erase oneself from the future. Yet Devavrata made this vow freely, for love of his father, and the heavens themselves trembled at the magnitude of his sacrifice. From that day forward, he was known as Bhishma, the one who took a terrible vow, and the gods, moved by his devotion, granted him a boon. He would not die until he chose to die. No weapon could kill him against his will. He would live as long as he wished, watching over the royal family of Hastinapura, bound by his oath to serve whoever sat on the throne. Do you see how the tragedy is already taking shape? Bhishma gave up everything, but in doing so, he tied himself to a family whose future would be marked by conflict and sorrow. His sacrifice was genuine and beautiful, yet it set in motion chains of causation that would lead inexorably toward war. Satyavati came to Hastinapura as queen. She brought with her the scent of river water and wild things, a reminder that the court was not as separate from the natural world as it pretended to be. She gave Shantanu 2 sons, Chitrangada and Vichitravirya. The old king died content, believing his lineage was secure. But the gods, it seems, are fond of irony. Chitrangada was killed in battle while still young, leaving no heirs. He had fought against a celestial being who shared his name, a Gandharva or heavenly musician, and though he displayed great courage, he was no match for a supernatural opponent. His death was the first of many premature endings that would plague this family. Vichitravirya was gentle and artistic, more interested in music and poetry than in matters of war and state. He married 2 princesses, Ambika and Ambalika, but he too died young, wasted by illness, before either of his wives could bear him a child. Some say he was consumed by excessive passion for his wives. Some say he simply had a weak constitution. Whatever the cause, he left behind 2 widows and no heir. There was also a 3rd princess, Amba, whose story adds another layer of tragedy to these events. When Bhishma had gone to win brides for his half-brother Vichitravirya, he had abducted 3 princesses from their father's court. 2 of them, Ambika and Ambalika, accepted their fate. But Amba had already given her heart to another king, and she begged to be released to go to him. Bhishma let her go, but the king she loved rejected her, saying she had been touched by another man and was therefore unfit to be his queen. Amba returned to Bhishma and demanded that he marry her himself, since he had ruined her prospects with anyone else. But Bhishma was bound by his vow of celibacy. He could not marry anyone. Amba was left with nothing. No husband, no home, no future. Her love had turned to hate, all of it focused on Bhishma, the man she blamed for her destruction. She performed terrible austerities, seeking the power to destroy him. Eventually she was granted a boon that she would be the cause of Bhishma's death in her next life. She threw herself into a fire and was reborn as Shikandi, a figure who would later play a crucial role in the great battle. Satyavati was desperate. The royal line was about to end. All of Bhishma's sacrifice, all of her own manoeuvring, would amount to nothing if there were no heirs. In her desperation she remembered her eldest son, the one she had borne long ago to a wandering sage before her marriage to Shantanu. This son was Vyasa himself, the dark-skinned compiler of the Mahabharata. According to ancient custom, when a man died without children, his brother could father heirs in his name. Since Vichitravirya had no brothers, and since Bhishma was bound by his vow of celibacy, Satyavati called upon Vyasa to perform this duty. And here the story takes a turn that reveals something important about how the ancient poets understood fate and consequence. Vyasa was not handsome. He was not courtly. He had spent his life in the wilderness, performing austerities, and his appearance reflected this harsh discipline. His hair was matted and wild. His body was thin from fasting. His eyes burned with an intensity that could unsettle even the bravest warrior. When Ambika saw him approaching her chamber, she was so frightened that she closed her eyes and kept them shut throughout their encounter. As a result, her son Dhritarashtra was born blind, his eyes sealed forever in the darkness his mother had chosen. When Ambalika saw Vyasa, she turned pale with fear, her blood retreating from her face as if trying to escape. As a result, her son Pandu was born with unnaturally pale skin, sickly and weak. Neither son was perfect, neither was entirely fit to rule, and yet from these two men, from their strengths and their limitations, would descend the great heroes of the Mahabharata. There was also a third son, born to a servant woman who was sent to Vyasa in place of Ambika when it was her turn to conceive again. This servant woman, unlike the princesses, showed no fear. She welcomed Vyasa with respect and kindness. As a result, her son Vidura was born wise and virtuous, the most morally upright of all the children. But because his mother was a servant, he could never inherit the throne. He would serve as an advisor, a voice of conscience in a court that increasingly ignored conscience. Dhritarashtra, the blind one, would father 100 sons and 1 daughter. His eldest son was Duryodhana, whose name means difficult to conquer, and who would become the chief antagonist of our story. Pandu, the pale one, would father 5 sons by his 2 wives, and these 5, known collectively as the Pandavas, would become the heroes of the epic. Their names were Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva. Each was said to be fathered not by Pandu himself, who was under a curse that prevented him from fathering children, but by different gods who blessed his wives. The story of Pandu's curse is essential to understanding what follows. While hunting in the forest, Pandu shot an arrow at what he thought was a deer mating with its doe. But the deer was actually a sage who had taken animal form to enjoy intimacy with his wife. As he lay dying, the sage cursed Pandu that he too would die if he ever tried to be intimate with a woman. This curse effectively ended Pandu's reign. He could not produce heirs in the normal way, and a king without heirs was a king without a future. He abdicated the throne to his blind brother Dhritarashtra and retired to the forest with his 2 wives, Kunti and Madri. There, in the wilderness, he lived as an ascetic, trying to accumulate spiritual merit to counterbalance his terrible sin. But Kunti had a secret. Years before her marriage, she had been granted a boon by a sage. She could invoke any god, and that god would come to her and give her a child. As a young girl, curious and foolish, she had tested the boon by calling upon the sun god Surya. He had appeared, radiant and irresistible, and had given her a son. Terrified of the scandal, Kunti had placed the baby in a basket and set it floating on the river, where it was found and raised by a charioteer. This abandoned son was Karna, and his story is one of the most poignant in the entire epic. Raised as a commoner, he always sensed he was destined for greatness. He sought out the finest teachers, endured incredible hardships to master the warrior arts, and eventually became the equal of Arjuna in archery. But because of his presumed low birth, he was constantly denied the recognition he deserved. Now, in the forest, Kunti revealed her boon to Pandu. He asked her to use it to give him sons, and she agreed. She invoked Dharma, the god of righteousness, and bore Yudhishthira, the eldest, who would never tell a lie. She invoked Vayu, the wind god, and bore Bhima, whose strength was as boundless as the wind itself. She invoked Indra, king of the gods, and bore Arjuna, who would become the greatest warrior of his generation. Kunti also shared the mantra with Madri, Pandu's second wife, who invoked the twin gods known as the Ashwins. She bore twin sons, Nakula and Sahadeva, one renowned for his beauty and skill with horses, the other for his wisdom and knowledge of the stars. 5 sons, each with a divine father, each destined for greatness. But their father Pandu would not live to see them grow. One day, overwhelmed by desire for Madri, he forgot the curse and embraced her. He died instantly, falling into her arms even as the curse took effect. Madri, consumed by guilt, threw herself on his funeral pyre, leaving the 5 boys to be raised by Kunti alone. Kunti brought her sons back to Hastinapura to claim their place in the royal household. They arrived as orphans, dependent on the charity of their blind uncle Dhritarashtra and the protection of their great-grandfather Bhishma. The stage was set for the conflicts that would consume the next generation. Can you feel the complexity building? The family tree is already tangled with divine interventions, terrible vows, curses, and boons. Each generation passes down not only its kingdom but also its unresolved karma. The sins of the ancestors ripple forward, shaping the destinies of those who come after. This is the ancient Indian understanding of cosmic justice. Every action has consequences. Every choice matters. The universe keeps perfect accounts, and eventually, all debts must be paid. The Mahabharata is, in many ways, a meditation on this truth. It shows us characters struggling against the weight of what has come before, trying to forge their own paths while bound by chains they did not choose. Let these thoughts settle gently as you rest. The ancestors are in place now. The stage is set. In the chambers of Hastinapura, 2 branches of the family are growing, like 2 trees planted too close together, their roots competing for the same soil, their branches reaching for the same light. The childhood of rivals. Now we come to the princes themselves, and to the golden years of their childhood in the great palace of Hastinapura. Let your imagination drift with me through those ancient corridors, where the soft slap of sandals on stone echoes off high ceilings, and the smoke of incense creates veils of fragrant mist. The Pandavas and the Kauravas, as the 2 groups of cousins were called, grew up together in a world of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary pressure. They were princes of the most powerful kingdom in northern India. From birth they were surrounded by attendants, tutors, priests, and advisors. Their every need was anticipated. Their every talent was cultivated. And yet, even in childhood, the seeds of future conflict were taking root. Picture the royal nursery, a vast hall filled with the sounds of children at play. The walls were painted with scenes from the great myths, gods and demons and heroes engaged in eternal struggles. The floor was covered with soft carpets woven in patterns that seemed to move in the lamplight. Toys of every description were scattered about, carved animals and miniature chariots and sets of dice made from ivory. The Kaurava brothers numbered 100, though only a few of them play significant roles in the story. They moved through the palace like a small army, always together, always watching out for each other. At their head was Duryodhana, the eldest, who showed leadership qualities from a very young age. He was bold and confident, quick to take offence, and slow to forgive. His closest companion was his brother Dushasana, who was utterly devoted to him. The Pandavas were fewer in number, but no less remarkable. Yudhishthira, the eldest, was calm and thoughtful, more interested in philosophy than in the rough games the other boys played. Bhima was a giant even as a child, twice the size of boys his age, with an appetite to match. Arjuna was serious and focused, always practicing, always trying to improve. The twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences, sharing each other's thoughts. Dhritarashtra, the blind king, loved his sons with a fierce and protective love. Perhaps because he could not see them, he held them even closer in his heart. His eldest son, Duryodhana, was his particular favourite, a strong and ambitious boy who seemed destined for greatness. The blind king could hear his son's confident voice, feel the strength in his young hands, and he dreamed of the day when Duryodhana would rule the kingdom that his own blindness had denied him. But there was always the question of legitimacy. Dhritarashtra was the elder brother, but Pandu had actually ruled as king while Dhritarashtra served as regent. When Pandu died, the question arose anew. Who should inherit? The sons of the elder brother who had never ruled, or the sons of the younger brother who had actually worn the crown? This ambiguity poisoned the relationships between the cousins from the very beginning. The Kauravas, led by Duryodhana, saw the Pandavas as rivals who might steal what was rightfully theirs. The Pandavas, for their part, knew that their claim was at least as strong and perhaps stronger than that of their cousins. And yet, in those early years, there was also genuine affection. Children are not born hating, they have to learn it. The palace was full of games and laughter, of running feet and shouted challenges. The boys played together, wrestled together, competed together. They were family after all. They shared the same ancestors, they ate at the same table, they worshipped the same gods. The women of the palace played crucial roles in shaping these young lives. Queen Gandhari, mother of the Kauravas, was a woman of extraordinary character. Born a princess of the mountain kingdom of Gandhara, she had been given in marriage to the blind Dhritarashtra as part of a political alliance. Upon learning that her husband was blind, she had tied a cloth over her own eyes, vowing never to have an advantage over him that sight would give. For the rest of her life she moved through the world in self-imposed darkness, navigating by memory and touch and the help of her servants. Kunti, mother of the Pandavas, was quite different. She was practical and protective, always watching for threats to her sons, always manoeuvring to improve their position. She had known hardship in ways Gandhari had not. She had given up her first son. She had lived as an exile in the forest. She had lost her husband to a terrible curse. These experiences had made her strong but also wary, always expecting the worst, always prepared to fight. Between these two mothers, the princes were shaped by different visions of what it meant to be noble. Gandhari taught her sons that royalty meant accepting the burdens fate placed upon you, even if those burdens seemed unfair. Kunti taught her sons that royalty meant fighting for what was rightfully yours, even against overwhelming odds. The most important development in their young lives was the arrival of their teacher. His name was Drona, and he was a Brahmin who had mastered all the arts of war. His story alone could fill many nights, but let us simply say that he had come to Hastinapura seeking patronage, and Bhishma, recognizing his genius, appointed him as the royal tutor. Drona's arrival at the court came after years of hardship and humiliation. He had been born to poverty, the son of a sage who owned nothing but his wisdom. As a young man, he had studied alongside the prince of Panchala, Drupada, and the two had become close friends. Drupada had promised that when he became king, he would share his kingdom with Drona. But promises made by boys are easily forgotten by men. When Drupada inherited his throne, Drona went to him as a supplicant, hoping to remind him of their friendship. Drupada laughed in his face. "A king cannot be friends with a penniless priest," he said. "Friendship requires equality, and there is no equality between us." This humiliation burned in Drona's heart. He vowed to have revenge, to prove his worth in ways that Drupada could not ignore. He sought out the greatest masters of weapons and learned everything they could teach. He became the finest warrior teacher in all of India, and when Bhishma offered him the position of royal tutor in Hastinapura, he accepted, knowing that one day his students would help him settle his score with Drupada. Under Drona's instruction, the princes learned everything a warrior of that age needed to know. They learned to ride horses and elephants, to drive chariots at breakneck speed across rough terrain. They learned to fight with swords and maces, with spears and axes. But above all, they learned archery, the supreme martial art of ancient India. The training grounds of Hastinapura were vast, sprawling fields outside the city walls where the princes practiced from dawn to dusk. The air was thick with dust raised by pounding hooves and running feet. The sound of arrows thudding into targets formed a constant rhythm, punctuated by the clash of swords and the grunts of wrestlers. Drona moved among his students like a general reviewing his troops, offering praise here, correction there, always watching, always evaluating. Archery in the ancient world was more than simple skill with a bow. It was a spiritual discipline. To shoot an arrow truly, one had to achieve perfect stillness of mind and body. One had to see the target not as separate from oneself, but as an extension of one's own intention. The great archers could perform feats that seemed miraculous, guiding their arrows around obstacles, striking multiple targets with a single shot, lighting their arrows with supernatural fire. Among all the princes, one stood out from the very beginning. Arjuna, the third of the Pandavas, showed a natural aptitude for archery that surpassed anything Drona had ever seen. The boy was dedicated, practicing until his fingers bled, rising before dawn to shoot by starlight, pushing himself beyond all reasonable limits. Drona came to love Arjuna like a son, and promised to make him the greatest archer in the world. There is a story that illustrates Arjuna's extraordinary dedication. The princes were required to practice for a certain number of hours each day, but Arjuna was never satisfied with the minimum. He would continue shooting long after the others had gone to rest. One night, while eating his meal in the dark, he noticed that his hand found his mouth automatically, without needing to see. He realized that the same principle could apply to archery. If he could shoot by feel rather than by sight, he could practice at any hour. From that day forward, Arjuna practiced at night as well as during the day. The sound of his arrows could be heard throughout the palace at all hours, a constant reminder of his obsession with perfection. Drona, hearing this, was deeply moved. He gave Arjuna special instruction, teaching him techniques he shared with no other student. This favoritism did not go unnoticed. Duryodhana watched his cousin receive praise and special attention, and a hard knot of resentment formed in his chest. He practiced just as hard, but he could not match Arjuna's natural gift. He compensated by becoming expert with the mace, a weapon that suited his aggressive, straightforward personality. But it was not the same. Archery was the king of skills, and Arjuna was its master. The story of Ekalavya reveals the darker side of Drona's character and the rigid social hierarchies of the age. Ekalavya was a tribal boy, born outside the caste system, who desperately wanted to learn archery from Drona. When Drona refused to teach him, saying he only instructed princes, Ekalavya went into the forest and made a clay statue of Drona. He practiced before this statue every day, treating it as his teacher, and through sheer dedication he became an archer of phenomenal skill. One day, the princes were hunting in the forest when they encountered Ekalavya. A dog had been barking at him, and Ekalavya had filled its mouth with arrows so skillfully that the dog was unharmed but could not make a sound. The princes were amazed. Who had taught this boy such mastery? Ekalavya said that Drona was his teacher, pointing to the clay statue. Drona was troubled. He had promised Arjuna that Arjuna would be the greatest archer in the world. Yet here was someone who might surpass him, someone who had learned from a mere statue. Drona went to Ekalavya and acknowledged him as a student. Then he demanded the traditional fee that a student pays his teacher. He demanded Ekalavya's right thumb. Without hesitation, Ekalavya cut off his own thumb and presented it to Drona. His days as a great archer were over. He had paid a price that ensured Arjuna's supremacy. This episode troubles modern readers, and it should. The Mahabharata does not sanitize its heroes. It shows them as they were, with all their flaws and prejudices. Drona's cruelty to Ekalavya was a reflection of his society's values, which placed enormous importance on caste and birth. But the poets included this story, which means they wanted us to see it, to wrestle with it, to question whether it was just. There is a famous story from these years that reveals much about the characters of the princes. One day, Drona gathered all his students and asked them to aim at a wooden bird fixed to the top of a tree. Before they shot, he asked each one what they could see. The first prince said, "I see the tree, the sky, my brothers standing beside me, and the bird." Drona told him to step aside. The second prince said, "I see the tree and the bird." Drona told him to step aside as well. One by one, the princes described what they saw, and one by one, Drona dismissed them. Finally, he came to Arjuna. "What do you see?" "I see only the eye of the bird," Arjuna replied. "Can you see the tree?" "No." "Can you see your brothers?" "No." "Can you see even the bird itself?" "No. I see only its eye." "Then shoot." The arrow flew true, piercing the wooden bird through its painted eye. This is concentration. This is the kind of focus that separates the merely good from the truly great. Arjuna had learned to narrow his attention to a single point, excluding everything else from his awareness. It is a skill that any of us can develop, though few have Arjuna's natural capacity for it. But greatness attracts jealousy, and Arjuna's light cast a shadow on his cousins. Duryodhana began to plot, even in those early years. He tried various schemes to harm the Pandavas, attempts that grew more serious as time went on. He mixed poison into Bhima's food, taking advantage of Bhima's enormous appetite and the chaos of a large feast. Bhima consumed the poison and fell unconscious, his great body lying still as death. Duryodhana had his servants throw Bhima into the river, expecting him to drown, but Bhima's supernatural constitution, a gift from his divine father, the wind god Vayu, allowed him to survive. The poison that would have killed any other man merely put Bhima into a deep sleep. He sank to the bottom of the river and entered the realm of the Nagas, the serpent beings who dwell in the waters. The Nagas recognized Bhima as no ordinary human. Their king gave him a special drink that neutralized the poison and increased his strength 100-fold. When Bhima emerged from the river days later, he was more powerful than ever, but he did not tell his brothers what had happened. He kept his near-death experience secret, perhaps not wanting to start an open war while they were still children. Duryodhana also arranged for the Pandavas to stay in a palace made of lacquer in a town called Varanavata. The plan was to burn the palace down while they slept, making their deaths look like an accident. But they were warned by their uncle Vidura, who sent them a cryptic message that only Yudhishthira understood. The Pandavas dug a secret tunnel out of the palace and escaped on the night of the fire. To cover their escape, they left behind the bodies of a tribal woman and her 5 sons who had been drinking at a festival and had fallen asleep in the palace. The fire consumed these bodies, and everyone assumed the Pandavas had perished. For months, the 5 brothers and their mother wandered in disguise, letting their enemies believe they were dead. These early assassination attempts were hushed up, dismissed as misunderstandings or accidents. The blind king Dhritarashtra either did not know or chose not to see the evil growing in his son's heart. Queen Gandhari, Duryodhana's mother, had blindfolded herself on her wedding day as a gesture of solidarity with her sightless husband, and she remained metaphorically blind to her son's faults as well. Meanwhile, the Pandavas were growing into extraordinary men. Yudhishthira, the eldest, was known for his wisdom and his unwavering commitment to truth. He never told a lie, even when a lie might have served him well. This made him a natural leader, someone others trusted implicitly. Bhima was a giant of a man, possessed of strength that seemed to have no limit. He could tear trees from the earth with his bare hands. He ate enough for 10 men at every meal. His temper was fierce, but so was his loyalty to his brothers. Arjuna we have already met. The peerless archer, the beloved student, the one who seemed touched by destiny for great things. Behind him came the twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, born to Pandu's second wife Madri. Nakula was said to be the most beautiful man of his age, his face so perfect that even the gods envied him. Sahadeva was the wisest, blessed with the gift of prophecy, though he rarely spoke of what he foresaw. These 5 brothers loved each other with an intensity that is hard to imagine today. They had grown up as orphans, their father dead, their mother Kunti raising them in the shadow of their powerful cousins. They had only each other. They protected each other. They completed each other. Together, they were formidable. Apart, they were vulnerable. This sleep story history pauses here to let you appreciate what the ancient poets were doing. They were not simply telling a story of good against evil. They were showing us the complexity of human relationships, the way love and resentment can grow side by side, the way family can be both sanctuary and battlefield. The Kauravas were not monsters. They were men, with their own fears and desires, their own sense of grievance and entitlement. Understanding this makes the tragedy that follows all the more heartbreaking. The winning of Draupadi and the rise of the Pandavas. While the Pandavas wandered in exile, letting the world believe they had died in the fire, events were unfolding that would bring them back into the light. A great king named Drupada, the same who had humiliated Drona years before, announced a contest for the hand of his daughter Draupadi. Draupadi was no ordinary princess. She had not been born in the usual way, but had emerged fully grown from a sacrificial fire, a daughter given to Drupada by the gods in answer to his prayers. Her skin was the colour of dark honey. Her hair fell to her knees in waves of deepest black. Her eyes were like lotus petals, and when she walked, she seemed to float rather than step. Suitors came from every kingdom, drawn by her beauty and by the power that an alliance with Drupada would bring. The contest was fiendishly difficult. A great bow had been set up in the arena, a bow so heavy that most men could not even lift it. Those who could lift it had to string it. Those who could string it had to shoot 5 arrows through a small revolving target reflected in a pool of water below. The contestant had to aim at the reflection while hitting the actual target above. Kings and princes from across the land attempted the feat and failed. Strong men could not bend the bow. Skilled archers could not hit the target. Duryodhana tried and failed. Karna, the great warrior who had allied himself with the Kauravas, was about to try when Draupadi announced that she would not marry the son of a charioteer. It was a cruel rejection based on caste prejudice, but it would have enormous consequences, deepening Karna's resentment and cementing his loyalty to Duryodhana. Then a young Brahmin rose from the crowd. He was simply dressed, with nothing to suggest he was anything other than what he appeared to be. But he lifted the bow with ease, strung it in a single motion, and sent 5 arrows through the revolving target with perfect accuracy. The crowd gasped. The young Brahmin was Arjuna in disguise. There was uproar in the assembly. Kings protested that a Brahmin should not compete in a warrior's contest. Fighting broke out. Bhima, also in disguise, tore a tree from the earth and used it as a weapon, scattering the angry nobles. The Pandavas escaped with Draupadi and made their way to the humble potter's hut where they were staying with their mother. As they approached the hut, they called out, as they always did, "Mother, see what we have brought home today." Kunti, not looking up from her work, replied, "Whatever it is, share it equally among yourselves." She had assumed they were talking about alms or food, as was usual for wandering Brahmins. When she looked up and saw Draupadi, she was horrified. Her words could not be taken back. A mother's command was sacred. And so, in a strange turn that has puzzled readers for centuries, Draupadi became the common wife of all 5 Pandava brothers. This polyandrous marriage was unusual even by the standards of the time. The epic offers various justifications for it. Some say it was fate, determined in a previous life. Some say it was necessary to maintain the unity of the brothers. Some say it was Kunti's fear that a single wife would create jealousy and division among her sons. Whatever the reason, Draupadi accepted her unusual role and became the heart of the Pandava household. The marriage of Draupadi revealed that the Pandavas were alive. This news reached Hastinapura and caused consternation. Duryodhana's plots had failed. His rivals had returned, stronger than ever, with a powerful new ally in Drupada. A settlement was proposed. The kingdom would be divided. The Pandavas would receive the western half, a tract of wilderness called Kandavaprastha, while the Kauravas kept prosperous Hastinapura. It seemed like a poor bargain, but Yudhishthira accepted it, preferring peace to continued conflict. What the Pandavas built in Kandavaprastha was the city of Indraprastha, a marvel that made even Hastinapura seem provincial. With the help of divine architects, they created a palace of such beauty and ingenuity that visitors could not tell the difference between solid floors and reflecting pools, between open doorways and painted walls. The gardens were filled with trees that bore fruit in every season. The fountains played music as they splashed. The walls were covered in beaten gold that caught the sunlight and scattered it like a blessing. The construction of Indraprastha required the clearing of the Kandava forest, and this was accomplished with the help of the fire god Agni, who consumed the forest in a great conflagration. During this burning, Arjuna protected Agni from the rain god Indra, who tried to extinguish the flames to save the creatures within. It was a controversial act, the destruction of an entire ecosystem, and it earned the Pandavas both powerful allies and bitter enemies. During the burning of the Kandava forest, Arjuna and Krishna saved a demon named Maya from the flames. In gratitude, Maya offered to build anything they wished. They asked him to construct a palace for the Pandavas, and Maya created the famous Sabha, the assembly hall of Indraprastha. This was the palace of illusions that would later cause Duryodhana such humiliation. Maya was an architect of supernatural skill. He built the hall using materials from the demonic realms, crystals that seemed solid but were actually hollow, metals that reflected light in unexpected ways, water that looked like stone and stone that looked like water. The effect was disorienting for anyone who did not know the secrets of the construction. The Pandavas prospered. Yudhishthira performed a great ritual sacrifice called the Rajasuya, which established him as a paramount king, acknowledged by rulers from across the known world. Treasures flowed into Indraprastha from every direction. The people were happy. The harvests were abundant. It seemed that the Pandavas had finally escaped the shadow of their childhood, had finally found the peace and security they deserved. The game of dice. The years passed as years do, carrying the princes from boyhood into manhood. Hair silvered at the temples, muscles thickened, voices deepened, and the tensions that had simmered beneath the surface began to boil over. Duryodhana came to visit Indraprastha, and what he saw filled him with a jealousy that burned hotter than any fire. The magnificence of Indraprastha was an insult to everything he believed about his own superiority. That his despised cousins should have built something so beautiful, should have achieved such recognition, was intolerable. There is a famous episode from his visit that captures his humiliation. Walking through the Palace of Illusions, he came to what appeared to be a solid floor and stepped onto it, only to plunge into a pool of water. His silken robes were soaked, his dignity was ruined, and he heard laughter, or thought he heard laughter, from the Pandava queen Draupadi, who was standing nearby. Some say she laughed, some say she did not. The ancient texts give different accounts. But Duryodhana believed she had mocked him, and that belief lodged in his heart like a splinter, festering and poisoning everything it touched. He would have his revenge on the Pandavas, and especially on Draupadi. He would humiliate them as they had humiliated him. Upon returning to Hastinapura, Duryodhana went to his uncle Shakuni, his mother's brother. Shakuni was a master of dice, a gambler who had never lost a game in his life. Some said he used loaded dice carved from his own father's bones. Some said he had made a pact with dark powers that allowed him to control the fall of the ivory cubes. Whatever the truth, his skill was unmatched. Shakuni had his own reasons for wanting to destroy the Kuru dynasty. His sister Gandhari had been married to the blind Dhritarashtra against her will, given to a man she could never love as part of a political arrangement. Shakuni had watched his sister sacrifice her sight, sacrifice her happiness, sacrifice everything for a husband and a family that treated her as nothing more than a vessel for heirs. His hatred for the house of Kuru ran deep, and he was happy to use his nephew's jealousy as a weapon. Together, Duryodhana and Shakuni hatched a plan. They would invite Yudhishthira to a game of dice. Yudhishthira, they knew, had a weakness for gambling. It was his one vice, the single flaw in his otherwise spotless character. He could not resist a challenge, could not walk away from a game once it had begun. This weakness would be their weapon. The invitation was sent, and honour demanded that Yudhishthira accept. To refuse a challenge was unthinkable for a king of his standing. And so the Pandavas came to Hastinapura, entered the great assembly hall where the game was to be played, and sat down opposite Shakuni. Picture the scene. The hall was vast, its columns rising to a ceiling painted with scenes from the heavens. Courtiers lined the walls, watching in silence. The blind king Dhritarashtra sat on his throne, pretending to be merely an observer, though he knew exactly what his son was planning. Bhishma sat nearby, his ancient face troubled, bound by his vow to support whoever ruled but tormented by what he saw unfolding. Vidura, the wise uncle, had tried to prevent this game from happening, but his warnings had been ignored. The game began. Yudhishthira wagered gold. He lost. He wagered jewels. He lost. He wagered horses, elephants, chariots, provinces. He lost everything. Each time, he told himself that the next throw would reverse his fortune. Each time, Shakuni's dice fell against him. As a relaxing history documentary, we must acknowledge that this part of the story is not relaxing at all. It is agonizing. It is watching a great man destroy himself, knowing what is coming and being powerless to stop it. The ancient poets wanted us to feel this agony, to understand how quickly everything can be lost, how a single weakness can undo a lifetime of virtue. The atmosphere in the hall grew heavier with each throw of the dice. The watchers barely breathed. Vidura made one last attempt to stop the game, warning that it would lead to the destruction of the entire dynasty. Dhritarashtra told him to be silent. Duryodhana's eyes gleamed with triumph as he watched his cousin's mounting losses. Yudhishthira wagered his kingdom. He lost. He wagered his brothers, one by one. He lost. He wagered himself, his own freedom. He lost. And then, in the moment of his deepest despair, Shakuni made a suggestion that still echoes through the centuries. You have one possession left, king. Your queen, Draupadi. Wager her. Yudhishthira hesitated. Every voice in the hall should have cried out in protest. Draupadi was not property to be wagered. She was a queen, a noblewoman, a human being with her own dignity and rights. But the gambling madness had Yudhishthira in its grip, and he threw the dice. He lost. What followed next is the most controversial and disturbing episode in the entire Mahabharata. Duryodhana, drunk with victory, sent his brother to drag Draupadi into the assembly hall. She was not told what had happened. She did not know that she had been wagered and lost. She came not of her own will, still dressed in a single garment, her hair unbound, in a state no queen should be seen in public. It was the time of her monthly cycle, a time when women were considered ritually secluded, making her public appearance even more humiliating. Dushasana dragged her by the hair, pulling her through the corridors of the palace, past servants and guards who looked away rather than intervene. When she reached the assembly hall, she looked around in disbelief at the silent faces of men who should have protected her. Her husband sat with bowed heads, unable to meet her eyes. The elders who had witnessed her wedding sat without speaking. Only Vidura raised his voice in protest, and he was shouted down. Draupadi was forced to stand before the assembled court, while Duryodhana and his brothers mocked her. She was asked to sit on Duryodhana's thigh, like a common slave girl. She was told that she now belonged to the Kauravas, to do with as they pleased. In her desperation, Draupadi raised a question that shook the foundations of Dharma itself. If my husband had already lost himself before he wagered me, then he was no longer a free man. How can a slave wager another person? How can someone who has already lost himself make a bet? The elders in the assembly were troubled. Bhishma, who had lived for centuries upholding the law, admitted that he could not untangle this question. The rules of Dharma were clear in most situations, but this one presented a paradox that had no easy answer. Duryodhana, impatient with philosophy, ordered his brothers to strip Draupadi of her garment. It was the final degradation, the ultimate expression of his need to dominate and humiliate. His brother Dushasana seized the edge of her cloth and began to pull. What happened next is remembered as a miracle. Draupadi, abandoned by her husbands, abandoned by the elders who should have protected her, called out to the divine. She called out to Krishna, the god who had befriended the Pandavas, and she surrendered herself completely to his protection, and as Dushasana pulled at her garment, more cloth appeared. Yards and yards of silk, endless fabric, until the floor of the assembly hall was piled with it and Dushasana collapsed in exhaustion, having failed to accomplish his shameful goal. This moment represents something profound about the nature of faith and surrender. When all human resources have been exhausted, when every friend has failed and every protector has stood silent, there is still the possibility of divine grace. Draupadi did not simply pray for rescue. She let go of everything, even her sense of personal dignity and control, and in that letting go she found protection. The blind king Dhritarashtra, alarmed by the supernatural turn events had taken and by the dark omens that began to manifest in the hall, hastily freed Draupadi and returned everything to the Pandavas. Jackals had begun howling outside the palace. A donkey had brayed during the game, which was considered a terrible sign. The king feared divine retribution if the injustice continued. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis had passed. But Duryodhana would not be denied. He went to his father and pleaded, threatened, cajoled. One more game, he insisted. Just one more, with higher stakes. If the Pandavas lost, they would go into exile for 13 years, spending the final year in disguise. If they were recognized during that final year, the exile would begin again. If they won, the Kauravas would face the same penalty. The invitation was sent. Once more, honor demanded acceptance. Once more, Shakuni's dice fell against Yudhishthira. The Pandavas had lost everything for the second time. Now they had to leave behind their kingdom, their palace, their wealth, and wander in the wilderness for 13 long years. They exchanged their silken robes for simple clothes of bark and deerskin. They unbound their elaborately dressed hair and let it fall tangled around their shoulders. Before she left, Draupadi made a vow. She would not bind her hair again until it was washed in the blood of Dushasana, the man who had tried to dishonor her. This vow hung in the air like a prophecy, a promise of the violence that would someday come. Bhima also made vows that day. He swore to drink the blood of Dushasana. He swore to break the thighs of Duryodhana, the thighs that had been offered to Draupadi as an obscene invitation. These vows, made in the heat of righteous anger, would be fulfilled in the war to come. And so the Pandavas walked out of Hastinapura, out of the life they had known, and into the wild forests of ancient India. The birds fell silent as they passed. The trees seemed to bow in sympathy. The rivers murmured words of comfort. The entire natural world witnessed their departure, as if nature itself understood that something precious had been broken, and that the breaking would have consequences that reached far beyond this single family. The long exile in the forest. Close your eyes now and imagine the forests of ancient India. These were not small woodlands, but vast, trackless wildernesses stretching for hundreds of miles. Beneath the canopy, the light was perpetual green twilight. The air was thick with the calls of birds and the rustle of unseen creatures. Orchids bloomed on fallen logs. Streams carved channels through black soil that smelled of rot and regeneration. Into this world the Pandavas went, accompanied by Draupadi and a few loyal attendants. They had gone from sleeping on silk cushions to sleeping on beds of leaves. They had gone from feasting on elaborate meals served in golden dishes to eating roots and fruits foraged from the forest floor. The transition was brutal, especially for those who had known nothing but luxury. The first nights were the hardest. Draupadi, who had been born from fire and raised as a princess, now lay on the bare ground, insects crawling across her skin, the sounds of the forest keeping her awake. Her husbands, helpless to improve her situation, could only offer words of comfort and promises of future vengeance. But there is a strange mercy in exile, away from the intrigues of the court, away from the constant competition and comparison. The Pandavas found a kind of peace. The forest does not care about titles or kingdoms. The forest only asks that you respect its rhythms, that you learn to read its signs, that you become, in some measure, wild yourself. The 12 years they spent wandering before their year of disguise were years of transformation. Yudhishthira spent long hours in conversation with sages who lived as hermits in remote clearings. He asked questions about dharma, about duty, about the nature of justice and righteousness. The answers he received were often paradoxical, often challenging, but they deepened his understanding of what it means to be a good king, a good man. One of the most famous episodes from the exile involves a conversation between Yudhishthira and a yaksha, a nature spirit who guarded a sacred pool. The Pandava brothers had become separated while hunting, and one by one they came upon this pool. Each brother, desperately thirsty, tried to drink without answering the yaksha's questions, and each fell dead. Only Yudhishthira had the patience to engage with the spirit, answering riddle after riddle until his brothers were restored to life. The questions the yaksha asked, and Yudhishthira's answers, form one of the great philosophical dialogues in world literature. What is heavier than earth? What is higher than the sky? What is faster than the wind? What is more numerous than grass? The answers were, respectively, a mother is heavier than earth, a father is higher than the sky, the mind is faster than the wind, our thoughts are more numerous than grass. These riddles touched on every aspect of human existence. What is the path? The path followed by good people. What is news? This world is a pot, cooked by the sun and stirred by time, holding all creatures. What is the greatest wonder? That people die every day, yet the living think they will live forever. Bhima spent his exile in a state of simmering rage. Every indignity the family had suffered was burned into his memory. He practiced his fighting skills against trees, imagining each one was Duryodhana. He dreamed of the day when he would take his revenge, when his mace would crack the skulls of those who had humiliated his wife and brothers. During the exile, Bhima had an encounter that revealed his divine heritage. Wandering alone in the forest, he came upon an aged monkey lying across his path. Bhima, impatient and proud, told the monkey to move. The monkey said he was too old and weak to move, and invited Bhima to simply lift his tail out of the way. Bhima reached down to move the tail and found he could not. He used both hands. He used all his strength. The tail would not budge. Humbled, Bhima asked who this monkey was who possessed such power. The monkey revealed himself as Hanuman, the great hero who had served Lord Rama in an earlier age, the same wind god's son who was Bhima's divine half-brother. Hanuman blessed Bhima and promised that when the great war came, he would be present on Arjuna's banner, adding his roar to the terror of their enemies. Arjuna, perhaps the most restless of the brothers, embarked on a series of journeys that took him far from the forest and into realms of magic and wonder. He travelled to the Himalayas, to the abode of his divine father Indra, king of the gods. There, in the celestial realms, he learned new weapons and new skills that would serve him in the battles to come. The story of Arjuna's sojourn in heaven is rich with details that belong to the deepest layers of ancient Indian mythology. He acquired divine weapons, arrows that could summon fire or flood, that could make him invisible or multiply his image 100 times. He learned to fight in ways that mortal warriors could not imagine. But he also faced temptations, was cursed and blessed, and returned to his brothers a changed man. The most famous incident from Arjuna's celestial journey involved the Apsara Urvashi, a divine dancer of incomparable beauty. Urvashi fell in love with Arjuna and came to him at night, offering herself. But Arjuna refused her, saying he regarded her as a mother figure because she had once been the wife of his ancestor. Urvashi, enraged by this rejection, cursed Arjuna to spend a year as a eunuch, a man without masculinity. This curse, which seemed terrible at the time, would later prove to be a blessing, providing Arjuna with the perfect disguise for the 13th year of exile. During the exile, the Pandavas encountered many other characters whose stories interweave with theirs. They met the sage Markandeya, who told them stories within stories, tales that stretch back to the creation of the universe. They learned of the great floods that had destroyed previous worlds, of the gods and demons who had churned the cosmic ocean to produce the nectar of immortality, of the heroes and villains of ages past. One of the stories Markandeya told was the tale of Savitri, a princess who followed her husband into the realm of death itself and won him back through the power of her devotion. This story, still told to young women in India today, offered comfort to Draupadi, showing that a wife's faithfulness could overcome even the finality of death. They also visited the hermitage of Nara and Narayana, twin sages who were actually incarnations of the god Vishnu. It was here that Arjuna learned he was himself a partial incarnation of Nara, while Krishna was an incarnation of Narayana. The two friends, the human hero and the divine helper, were reflections of cosmic principles that had existed since before the world began. There is a beautiful episode where Draupadi questioned Yudhishthira about the nature of Dharma. How could it be right, she asked, that they suffered while the wicked Kauravas prospered? If Dharma protected the righteous, why were the righteous not protected? If the gods rewarded virtue, why was virtue not rewarded? Yudhishthira's answer was nuanced and honest. He admitted he did not know why the wicked sometimes flourished while the good suffered. But he said that he followed Dharma not because it guaranteed good outcomes, but because it was right. One should act righteously regardless of the results, not because righteousness is a bargain with the universe, but because it is its own reward. This is a profound teaching that still resonates today. We cannot control the outcomes of our actions. We can only control our intentions and our efforts. If we act rightly, we have done what we can. The rest is in hands larger than our own. The Mahabharata history contains many such embedded narratives, stories that the characters tell each other to pass the time, to teach lessons, to explore ideas. These stories are not digressions. They are essential to understanding the epic's full meaning. The Mahabharata is not just a tale of war. It is a repository of wisdom, a guidebook for living, a meditation on what it means to be human. For the Pandavas, the exile was also a time of solidarity. Whatever petty tensions might have existed between them dissolved in the crucible of shared hardship. They had only each other to rely on. They learned to read each other's moods, to anticipate each other's needs. The bond between them, already strong, became unbreakable. And always at the centre of their small community was Draupadi. Her hair remained unbound, a constant reminder of the insult that awaited vengeance. She cooked for her husbands using skills she had never needed to learn as a queen. She tended their wounds. She listened to their frustrations. She was the still point around which they revolved. There is something archetypal about this period of exile, something that resonates across cultures and times. The hero must enter the wilderness. The hero must be stripped of everything comfortable and familiar. Only then can the hero discover what lies at the core of their being, what cannot be taken away. The Pandavas entered the forest as princes. They would emerge as something more. The years passed slowly, marked by seasons rather than by events. Monsoon rains would come, turning the forest into a maze of streams and pools, and the brothers would take shelter in caves or under overhanging rocks, listening to the thunder and watching the lightning illuminate the wet leaves. Then the rains would pass, and the forest would steam in the returning sun, and the brothers would resume their wandering. They visited sacred sites, places where the veil between worlds was thin. They bathed in rivers that were said to wash away sins. They climbed to temples perched on impossible peaks. They sought out teachers who could help them prepare for what was to come. For they all knew, even when they did not speak of it, that the exile would end, that they would return to the world of men, that they would face their cousins again, and that when they did there would be war, the year of disguise. The 13th year was the most dangerous. If the Pandavas were recognized during this year, even once, even by accident, their exile would begin again from the beginning. They needed to disappear completely, to become invisible in plain sight. The solution they chose was audacious. They would hide in the court of a king named Virata, who ruled a small but prosperous kingdom. Each of the brothers and Draupadi would assume a disguise and take up a humble position in the king's household. Yudhishthira became Kanka, a Brahmin who served as a companion to the king, playing dice with him in the evenings. It was a bitter irony that the man who had lost everything to dice should now entertain a king with the same game, but Yudhishthira accepted it with the equanimity that defined his character. He had learned from his failures. He no longer gambled with anything that mattered. Bhima became Vallabha, a cook in the royal kitchens. His enormous appetite was explained as a professional dedication to tasting everything he prepared. In this disguise, the great warrior who had killed demons with his bare hands spent his days chopping vegetables and stirring pots. The kitchen staff grew to love him for his good humour and his willingness to do the hardest work. Arjuna's disguise was the most remarkable. Invoking the curse that Urvashi had laid upon him, he transformed himself into Brihanala, a eunuch who taught music and dance to the princess of Virata's household. The greatest archer in the world, the hero who had trained in the heaven of the gods, now spent his days demonstrating the steps of classical dance and correcting the finger positions of young noblewomen on the strings of instruments. The transformation was complete. Arjuna, dressed in women's clothes, wore bangles on his wrists and spoke in a soft voice. No one who had known him as the proud warrior would have recognized him. The curse had become a blessing, providing perfect cover for the most recognizable of the Pandava brothers. Nakula became a horse trainer, working in the royal stables. His skill with horses was legendary, and the animals responded to him as if he could read their thoughts. The king's horses grew sleek and strong under his care, winning races they had previously lost, responding to commands with uncanny precision. Sahadeva became a keeper of cattle. He wandered the pastures with the king's herds, sleeping under the stars, counting and caring for the animals in his charge. The cattle flourished under his management, giving more milk, producing more calves, as if they sensed they were tended by someone who truly understood them. And Draupadi became Sayarandri, a maidservant to the queen, styling hair and selecting garments and running the small errands that fill a noblewoman's day. It was perhaps the hardest disguise of all, for Draupadi had been a queen herself, had been dressed and served by others. Now she had to bow her head, to accept orders, to pretend that she was nothing more than a servant. Can you imagine what this year must have been like? To be so close to exposure every moment, to watch every word, to never relax, to never let the mask slip. The Pandavas had spent 12 years in the forest, but that hardship was nothing compared to this. In the forest they could be themselves. In Virata's court they had to be someone else, constantly, perfectly, under pain of losing everything. They developed signals and codes, ways of communicating with each other without revealing their identities. A particular phrase, a gesture, a way of arranging flowers could convey a message. They met in secret when they could, but these meetings were rare and brief. There were close calls. Draupadi, even in her simple servant's clothes, was too beautiful to escape notice. One of the king's generals, a man named Kichaka, became obsessed with her. He pursued her relentlessly, ignoring her refusals, threatening her when she resisted. The Pandavas could do nothing to help without revealing themselves. Kichaka was the brother of the queen, powerful and connected. He had never been denied anything he wanted, and he could not understand why this servant girl continued to reject him. His pursuit became more and more aggressive. He cornered Draupadi at night. He sent her threatening messages. He told her that he would have her whether she consented or not. Finally, Draupadi went to Bhima in secret and begged him to act. She could not endure Kichaka's harassment any longer. Bhima agreed, and that night, in a darkened dance hall, he killed Kichaka with his bare hands, crushing him so thoroughly that the body could barely be identified. The murder was attributed to angry Gandharvas, celestial spirits who were supposedly protecting Draupadi's honour. The death of the general sent shockwaves through the kingdom, but no one suspected the cook. No one suspected any of the humble servants who had been so quiet, so unremarkable, so easy to overlook. The year continued. The death of Kichaka had an unintended consequence. Duryodhana and the Kauravas had been searching for the Pandavas, hoping to discover them during their year of disguise and reset the exile. When they heard that a powerful general had been mysteriously killed, crushed as if by supernatural strength, they suspected Bhima might be involved. They decided to attack Virata's kingdom, both to test this theory and to raid his cattle. In its final days, the kingdom of Virata was invaded by the Kauravas themselves along with their allies. Perhaps they suspected the Pandavas were hiding there. Perhaps it was simply an opportunistic raid. Either way, the timing was significant. If the Pandavas could remain hidden just a little longer, they would be free. The crisis came when Virata's army marched out to meet one group of invaders, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to another group. The prince, still just a boy named Uttara, was left with no experienced warriors. In desperation, the princess mentioned that her dancing teacher, Brihanala, claimed to have once been the charioteer of the great Arjuna. Perhaps Brihanala could drive Uttara's chariot. Uttara was skeptical. A eunuch, a dancing teacher, driving a war chariot? It seemed ridiculous, but there was no one else. Brihanala agreed to serve, and the two of them drove out to face an entire Kaurava army. When they saw the enemy forces arrayed against them, Uttara panicked. He wanted to turn and flee. This was no skirmish but a full-scale invasion, led by the greatest warriors of the age. Drona was there. Bhishma was there. Karna was there. Duryodhana was there. How could one boy and a eunuch hope to stand against them? But then Brihanala revealed the truth. He drove the chariot to a specific tree, climbed into its branches, and retrieved a bundle of weapons that had been hidden there a year before. These were the Pandavas' divine weapons, including Arjuna's legendary bow Gandiva. As Arjuna strung his bow, his transformation was complete. The eunuch disappeared, and in his place stood the greatest warrior of the age. The curse had run its course. The year of disguise was over. What followed was a display of martial prowess that became legendary. Arjuna single-handedly defeated the entire Kaurava army. He did not kill the major warriors, for the time for that had not yet come, but he humiliated them, disarmed them, drove them from the field. His arrows flew so fast that they seemed to form a continuous stream of light. His chariot moved so swiftly that it seemed to be in multiple places at once. When the truth came out, King Virata was astonished. He had been harbouring the most famous heroes of the age without knowing it. His cook had been a slayer of demons. His stable hand had been a prince. His dancing teacher had been the greatest archer in the world. He fell at their feet, apologising for any disrespect he had inadvertently shown, begging for their forgiveness. The Pandavas reassured him. He had done nothing wrong. He had provided them with shelter and safety during the most dangerous year of their lives. They were grateful, not offended. They offered their eternal friendship and support. King Virata offered his daughter Uttara in marriage to Arjuna, but Arjuna declined. He had been her teacher, he said, and it would be inappropriate for him to become her husband. Instead, he suggested that she marry his son Abhimanyu, a young warrior of great promise. Virata agreed, and the wedding was celebrated with great joy. The year of disguise is often overlooked in retellings of the Mahabharata, but it contains important lessons. Sometimes strength means waiting, sometimes power means concealment. The Pandavas could have fought their way through this year, could have revealed themselves at the first provocation and trusted in their martial prowess, but they had the wisdom to endure humiliation, to serve in lowly positions, to swallow their pride day after day until the time was right. This is a different kind of heroism than we usually celebrate. It requires patience rather than action, acceptance rather than resistance. It is not the heroism of the charging warrior, but of the hidden seed, waiting beneath the soil for the season of growth, the embassy and the failed peace. The exile was over. The Pandavas had fulfilled every term of the agreement. By rights, their kingdom should be restored to them. They sent messages to Hastinapura, requesting what was theirs, but Duryodhana refused. He had grown accustomed to ruling the entire realm. He had no intention of giving up a single village, a single field, a single handful of dust. The Pandavas will not receive from me even as much land as can be covered by the point of a needle, he declared. The Pandavas tried diplomacy. They sent emissaries. They lowered their demands. Yudhishthira, ever the peacemaker, said he would accept just 5 villages, 1 for each brother. Even this Duryodhana refused. Finally, Krishna himself went to Hastinapura as an ambassador of peace. Krishna, whom many knew to be an avatar of the god Vishnu, the divine friend and protector of the Pandavas. His arrival was a last chance to avert the coming catastrophe. Krishna travelled in state, as befitted a king and a god. His entourage stretched for miles, a procession of elephants and chariots and foot soldiers that demonstrated his power and prestige. But he came in peace, with open hands, hoping that the display of what the Pandavas' allies could muster might convince Duryodhana to negotiate. Krishna's embassy to the Kauravas is one of the great dramatic set pieces in all of literature. Picture him entering the great hall of Hastinapura, surrounded by the assembled nobility, facing the blind king on his throne and Duryodhana standing defiant beside him. Picture the tension in the air, the held breath, the sense that everything hung in the balance. Krishna spoke of Dharma. He spoke of the bonds of family, of the ancient duty of kings to protect their subjects from the horrors of war. He reminded Duryodhana that war would not affect only soldiers. It would destroy families, wipe out entire generations, leave widows keening and children orphaned. Was pride worth such a price? He appealed to the elders in the hall. He asked Bhishma and Drona to use their influence. He reminded Dhritarashtra of his duty as king to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. He spoke with all the wisdom and eloquence at his command, and for a moment it seemed that even Duryodhana might be moved. But Duryodhana was beyond persuasion. His heart had hardened into something that words could not touch. He ordered his men to seize Krishna, to bind him and throw him in prison. It was an act of madness, an attempt to capture a god, but Duryodhana had lost all sense of proportion. At that moment, Krishna revealed his true nature. He abandoned his human form and showed the assembled court his cosmic aspect, the vision of the universe contained within a single being. From every pore of his body shone countless suns. In his mouth were all the worlds, past and present and future. The gods and sages were there, and all creatures and time itself, infinite and terrible. The court fell back in terror. Even Duryodhana covered his eyes. Only the blind king, who could not see, asked what was happening, and when it was described to him, he was granted temporary sight, so he too could witness the divine revelation. Then Krishna withdrew his universal form and stood again as a man, a prince, a friend. His message was clear. The Pandavas had divine support. War with them would be war against the cosmic order itself. But still, even after witnessing this manifestation of the divine, Duryodhana would not yield. Krishna returned to the Pandavas with news of his failure. Peace was impossible. War was inevitable. The only question remaining was how it would be fought. Both sides began to gather allies. Kings from across the known world were forced to choose sides. Some joined the Kauravas out of long-standing alliances or personal grudges against the Pandavas. Others joined the Pandavas because they saw their cause as just. The total number of warriors who would eventually take the field has been calculated at millions, though we should understand these numbers as symbolic rather than literal, expressing the epic scale of the conflict rather than actual demographics. Krishna himself was approached by both sides seeking his support. He offered a choice. On one side, his vast army, the legendary forces of Dwaraka. On the other side, himself alone, but refusing to take up weapons, Duryodhana, who arrived first, chose the army. Arjuna, who arrived later, chose Krishna himself. This choice would prove decisive. The Pandavas established their camp on one side of a great plain called Kurukshetra. This was no ordinary battlefield. It was sacred ground, a place where sages had performed rituals since the beginning of time. The soil itself was said to have absorbed countless prayers and offerings. To fight and die here was considered especially meritorious, a direct path to heaven. The Kauravas established their camp on the other side. Between the two armies lay the field where the fate of the world would be decided. In those final days before battle there was a strange stillness. Warriors who would soon be enemies made final visits to old friends on the other side. Priests performed rituals of purification. Armourers checked weapons and repaired the inevitable wear. Horses were groomed until their coats shone. Elephants were decorated with gold and crimson, the colours of war. Bhishma, the ancient patriarch who had taken that terrible vow so long ago, stood with the Kauravas. He did not support Duryodhana's cause. He knew it was unjust. But his vow bound him to serve whoever sat on the throne of Hastinapura, and Duryodhana held that authority. The tragedy of Bhishma is the tragedy of all those whose sense of duty leads them to serve causes they know to be wrong. Drona, who had taught both sets of princes, also stood with the Kauravas. He too knew that the Pandavas were in the right, but he had eaten the Kauravas' bread for many years, had accepted their gold and their honours. Loyalty to his employers outweighed loyalty to his favourite student. Karna, whom we have not yet discussed properly, also stood with the Kauravas. Karna is one of the most tragic figures in the entire epic. He was actually the eldest of the Pandava brothers, born to their mother Kunti before her marriage by the sun god himself. But she had abandoned him out of shame, and he had been raised by a charioteer, never knowing his true origins. He had allied with Duryodhana early in life because Duryodhana had shown him respect when others mocked his low birth. Now, even though he knew the truth about his parentage, he felt honour-bound to stand with the friend who had stood with him. Krishna made one last attempt to prevent tragedy. He went to Karna privately and revealed his true birth. He told Karna that he was actually a Pandava, the eldest of the brothers, and that if he switched sides, he would be welcomed as their leader, would receive the throne, would have Draupadi as his wife. Karna listened in silence. He knew Krishna spoke the truth, but he could not betray Duryodhana, the only person who had ever believed in him, the friend who had made him a king when the world saw him as nothing. He thanked Krishna for the offer and refused it. He would fight and die for the Kauravas. On the Pandava side stood Krishna, who had agreed to serve as Arjuna's charioteer. He would not fight himself, but his presence was a constant reminder that the divine was watching, was involved, was invested in the outcome. The night before the battle, the camps were quiet. Men who knew they might die in the morning wrote final letters to their families. They made peace with their gods. They tried to sleep, but found sleep would not come. The stars turned overhead, indifferent to human concerns, marking the hours until dawn. The great battle of Kurukshetra. This Hindu epic explained in any thorough way must spend considerable time on the battle itself, for the battle is the heart of the Mahabharata. But we will approach it softly, as befits a sleep story history, focusing not on the chaos and violence, but on the human drama that unfolded within the larger catastrophe. The battle lasted 18 days. 18 days of continuous fighting from dawn to dusk, with truces at night that allowed both sides to creep out onto the field and recover their wounded. 18 days during which the finest warriors of the age faced each other in combat, and most of them died. On the first morning, as the two armies lined up and the conch shells were about to sound the attack, something unexpected happened. Arjuna, the great hero, the peerless warrior, asked Krishna to drive their chariot into the space between the armies. He wanted to see who he would be fighting. When he looked, he saw his grandfather Bhishma. He saw his teacher Drona. He saw his cousins, his uncles, his childhood friends. He saw the faces of everyone he had ever loved on the opposite side of the field, all of them prepared to die, all of them prepared to kill him. And Arjuna's courage failed. His legendary bow slipped from his fingers. His body began to shake. He turned to Krishna and said words that have echoed through thousands of years of philosophy. "I cannot do this. I cannot kill my own family. What good is a kingdom won at the cost of those I love? What good is victory if it means the destruction of everyone I care about? Better to lay down my weapons and let them kill me than to bear the sin of slaying my own kin." What followed was the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, the most sacred and influential text in the Hindu tradition. There, in the space between the two armies, with millions of warriors waiting and the drums of war ready to thunder, Krishna spoke to Arjuna about the nature of the soul, about duty and action, about the relationship between humans and the divine. He told Arjuna that the soul is eternal, that it cannot be killed by weapons or burned by fire or drowned by water. What dies is only the body, the temporary clothing that the soul wears for a single lifetime. A warrior who kills in righteous battle does not truly kill, for the soul simply moves on to its next incarnation. He told Arjuna about karma yoga, the path of selfless action. One must act according to one's duty without attachment to the fruits of action. A warrior fights because it is his nature and his role to fight, not because he desires victory or fears defeat. The results are in God's hands. What matters is performing one's duty with perfect dedication. He told Arjuna about bhakti, the path of devotion and surrender to the divine. When one gives up the illusion of being the doer and recognizes that all action flows from God through human instruments, then one is freed from the bonds of karma. The devotee becomes like a channel through which divine will moves without obstruction. He told Arjuna about Gnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Through understanding the true nature of reality, one realizes that the distinctions between self and other, between life and death, are illusions. The wise person sees the same divine essence in all beings, and is not disturbed by the appearances of change. And finally, as we mentioned before, Krishna revealed his universal form, the vision of the entire cosmos contained within his being. Arjuna saw all the warriors on both sides rushing into the mouths of this cosmic being like rivers flowing into the ocean. He understood that their deaths were already determined, that he was merely the instrument of a larger pattern that had been set in motion long before his birth. When the vision faded, Arjuna picked up his bow. His doubts were resolved. He was ready to fight. This conversation between Arjuna and Krishna has been studied, interpreted, and debated for over 2,000 years. It is read at funerals and at births. It is quoted by politicians and saints. It has influenced everyone from Thoreau to Gandhi to Oppenheimer, who remembered a line from it when he witnessed the first atomic explosion. But let us return to the battle itself, which began moments after this cosmic dialogue concluded. The first 10 days were dominated by Bhishma's leadership of the Kaurava forces. The old patriarch was a terror on the battlefield, his chariot moving through the Pandava ranks like a reaper through wheat. No one could stand against him. His arrows flew so fast and thick that they seemed to form a continuous canopy of death over the field. The Pandavas died by thousands. Their cause seemed hopeless. Night after night, they gathered in their tent to strategize, to find some weakness in Bhishma's defense, and night after night they failed. Finally, they went to Bhishma himself. This seems strange, but it speaks to the complex loyalties of the epic. Bhishma was their enemy on the battlefield, but he was still their grandfather, still bound to them by blood and affection. They asked him directly how he could be defeated, and Bhishma told them he would not fight against anyone who had once been a woman. There was a warrior in the Pandava army named Shikhandi, who had been born female and later transformed into a man. If Shikhandi was placed at the front of the assault, Bhishma would lower his weapons rather than shoot. Shikhandi was the reincarnation of Amba, the princess whom Bhishma had wronged long ago. Her hatred had carried across lifetimes, waiting for this moment of revenge. She had been reborn specifically to cause Bhishma's death. It was a loophole, a technicality, but it was enough. On the 10th day, Arjuna advanced with Shikhandi as his shield. Bhishma saw them coming and set down his bow. The arrows that struck him were Arjuna's, but Bhishma did not resist. He fell from his chariot, his body so pierced with shafts that when he lay on the ground, the arrows themselves formed a bed that held him above the earth. But even in falling, Bhishma did not die. His boon held. He could not die until he chose to die, and he chose to wait, lying on his bed of arrows, until the battle was over and he could depart in a moment of cosmic auspiciousness. For nearly 2 more weeks, he lay there on the battlefield, watching the carnage unfold, offering counsel to whoever came to visit him. With Bhishma fallen, Drona took command of the Kaurava forces. The teacher proved as formidable as the grandfather. His knowledge of warfare was encyclopedic, and he invented new formations and tactics that the Pandavas struggled to counter. The casualties continued to mount on both sides. On the 13th day, Drona created a formation called the Chakravyuha, a spinning wheel of soldiers that was nearly impossible to penetrate. Only Arjuna knew how to enter and exit this formation, but Arjuna had been drawn away by other Kaurava warriors to a distant part of the battlefield. Abhimanyu, Arjuna's young son, knew how to enter the formation. He had learned it while still in his mother's womb, listening to Arjuna explain it. But Arjuna had been interrupted before explaining how to exit, and Abhimanyu had never learned that part. Despite knowing he might not survive, Abhimanyu entered the Chakravyuha alone. He fought with incredible valour, holding his own against the greatest warriors of the age. But eventually, surrounded and outnumbered, his weapons destroyed and his armour broken, he was killed by a group of warriors who attacked him simultaneously, violating the codes of honourable combat. The death of Abhimanyu was a turning point in the war. It was the first major breach of the rules of engagement, and it opened the door to all the dishonourable acts that followed. Arjuna's grief was boundless. He swore to kill Jayadratha, the warrior who had prevented others from coming to Abhimanyu's aid, or else kill himself the next day. The following day saw Arjuna hunting Jayadratha across the battlefield, and Krishna using his divine powers to create an eclipse that made Jayadratha think the day was over and lower his guard. Arjuna killed him at the last possible moment, fulfilling his vow. To defeat Drona, the Pandavas resorted to a terrible deception. They spread the rumour that his son Ashwatthama had been killed in battle. When Drona heard this, he was devastated. His son was everything to him. He turned to Yudhishthira, the one Pandava who never lied, and asked if the rumour was true. Yudhishthira faced an impossible choice. He could tell the truth and save his moral integrity, but Drona would continue fighting and more of his soldiers would die. Or he could lie, defeat Drona, and carry the stain of falsehood forever. He chose to lie, but in a way that preserved the technical truth. Ashwatthama is dead, he said, and then, under his breath, the elephant. There was an elephant named Ashwatthama that had indeed been killed that day. Drona heard only the first part. His will to live shattered. He laid down his weapons, sat in meditation, and allowed himself to be beheaded while in a state of spiritual absorption. This moment haunted Yudhishthira for the rest of his life. He had spoken words that he knew would deceive. The man who had never lied had finally lied, and though the lie served the greater good, it cost him something precious. The ancient poets understood that moral choices are rarely clean, that sometimes we must choose between evils, and that even the right choice can leave scars. The battle continued. Karna came forward as the Kaurava commander, and the confrontation between him and Arjuna was inevitable. These two were the greatest archers of their generation. One was celebrated, the other was spurned. One was legitimately born, the other was abandoned. They were brothers by blood but enemies by circumstance, and only one could survive. Their duel lasted for hours. Arrows met arrows in midair and shattered. Divine weapons were countered by other divine weapons. The watching armies fell silent, awed by the display of skill and power. Finally, Karna's chariot wheel sank into the mud, a consequence of a curse that had been laid on him long ago by the earth goddess herself. Karna dismounted and tried to free the wheel. He called upon Arjuna to wait, to observe the rules of warfare that forbade attacking an unarmed opponent. For a moment, Arjuna hesitated. But Krishna reminded him of all the times Karna had ignored those same rules, how he had participated in the dishonourable killing of Abhimanyu, how he had stood silent when Draupadi was humiliated. Arjuna fired the arrow that pierced Karna's chest. But even as Karna fell, there was no celebration in Arjuna's heart. He had killed his brother, though he did not yet know it was his brother. The truth would come out later, adding another layer of tragedy to an already unbearable loss. On the 18th and final day, Duryodhana stood alone. All of his brothers were dead. All of his allies were dead. The mighty army that had seemed invincible on the first morning was reduced to a handful of survivors. Duryodhana fled the battlefield and hid in a lake, using his magical powers to breathe underwater, planning to rest and fight again another day. The Pandavas found him there and challenged him to emerge and fight. Duryodhana agreed, but only to single combat, one-on-one, against whichever Pandava would face him. He chose the mace as his weapon, for that was his specialty, and Bhima stepped forward to meet him. The duel between Bhima and Duryodhana was a fitting end to the war. These two had been rivals since childhood, had hated each other with a purity that admitted no complexity. They circled each other in the twilight, their maces swinging in deadly arcs, the sound of iron striking iron ringing across the empty battlefield. They were evenly matched. For hours they fought, neither gaining a clear advantage. Finally, Bhima remembered a vow he had made long ago, in the gambling hall, after Draupadi was humiliated. He had sworn to break Duryodhana's thighs, the thighs that had been offered to Draupadi as an obscene insult. In fair combat, striking below the waist was forbidden, but Bhima's rage had no room for rules. He swung his mace low, shattering Duryodhana's thighs, bringing the Kaurava prince crashing to the ground. Duryodhana lay in the dust, dying slowly, as the surviving Pandavas gathered around him. Even in his final moments he was defiant. "You have won," he said. "But you have won through trickery and broken rules. I've lived as a king. I've enjoyed every pleasure. I have ruled the earth. And now I will die as a warrior and go straight to heaven. What have you won? A kingdom of corpses, a realm of ashes. You will have to live with what you have done." And there was truth in his words. The Pandavas had won, but the cost was beyond calculation. 18 Akshauhinis of warriors had taken the field, a number that tradition sets at nearly 4 million men. Almost all of them were dead. The battlefield was so thick with bodies that the ground could not be seen. The rivers ran red for days afterward. The vultures and jackals feasted for weeks. This was victory. This was what the Pandavas had fought for. An empty throne and the screams of widows echoing across the land. The aftermath and the final journey. In the days following the battle, the full weight of what had happened began to settle on the survivors. Yudhishthira, who had never wanted to be king, who had always preferred the contemplative life, was crowned in Hastinapura. The throne he had fought for was finally his. But there was no joy in his heart. He walked through the halls of the palace like a ghost, seeing the faces of the dead in every shadow. He could not eat. He could not sleep. The guilt of all the lives lost on both sides pressed down on him like a physical weight. Gandhari, the mother of the Kauravas, who had lost all 100 of her sons in the war, cursed Krishna for allowing this destruction. She said that as her family had been destroyed, so too would his family be destroyed. Krishna accepted the curse without protest, knowing it was just, knowing that his own clan would eventually tear itself apart in the same way. He went to Bhishma, who still lay on his bed of arrows, waiting for the auspicious moment to die. The old patriarch had been lying there for weeks, sustained by his will alone, and he used his final days to teach. He spoke to Yudhishthira about the duties of a king, about the nature of dharma, about philosophy and ethics and the proper ordering of society. These teachings fill a substantial portion of the Mahabharata and have been studied by political theorists and spiritual seekers for millennia. When the moment finally came, Bhishma released his hold on life. His soul departed from his body like an arrow shot toward the sun, and those who were present saw a streak of light ascending into the heavens. The bed of arrows crumbled to dust. The great patriarch was gone. Yudhishthira performed the funeral rites not only for Bhishma but for everyone who had died in the war. The pyres burned for days. The smoke rose so high that it seemed to merge with the clouds. The entire kingdom was in mourning. During this period, a terrible incident occurred that added one final tragedy to the already unbearable toll. Ashwatthama, the son of Drona, who had not actually died in battle, entered the Pandava camp at night. Maddened by grief and rage, he slaughtered everyone he found there, including the 5 young sons of the Pandavas, children who had not even fought in the war. When the Pandavas discovered this atrocity, their fury was boundless. They pursued Ashwatthama and cornered him, and in his desperation he unleashed a weapon of cosmic destruction, a weapon that was never meant to be used, a weapon that could sterilize the wombs of all Pandava women and end their line forever. The weapon could not be recalled, but through Krishna's intervention, its effect was limited to a single unborn child. The child was later born dead but restored to life by Krishna, and he was named Parikshit. He would be the only male descendant of the Pandavas, the sole survivor of the great dynasty. Ashwatthama was punished by having the jewel torn from his forehead, a jewel that had been part of him since birth and that had made him immortal. He was condemned to wander the earth forever, in pain and solitude, a living reminder of the costs of uncontrolled vengeance. The Pandavas ruled for many years after the war. Under Yudhishthira's governance, the kingdom recovered from its wounds. The fields were planted again, children were born, the rhythms of ordinary life resumed. But the king himself never forgot the war. He never forgave himself for his part in it. He ruled justly and well, but there was always a sadness in his eyes that nothing could dispel. Krishna eventually returned to his own kingdom of Dwaraka, but Gandhari's curse followed him. His clan, the Yadavas, began to quarrel among themselves. A drunken brawl turned into a massacre, and the entire tribe destroyed itself, just as the Kauravas and Pandavas had destroyed each other. Krishna himself was killed by a hunter who mistook him for a deer, an arrow striking his foot, the one vulnerable spot on his body. Eventually, the Pandavas decided it was time to leave. They had done their duty. They had raised Parikshit to be a worthy successor. There was nothing more for them in the world of men. They resolved to undertake the final pilgrimage, the journey to the Himalayas from which no one returns. They gave up their kingdom. They gave up their possessions. They put on simple clothes of bark and began to walk north toward the great mountains that marked the edge of the known world. A dog followed them, an ordinary street dog that had attached itself to their party, and they let it come. As they climbed higher and higher into the mountains, the world they had known fell away behind them. The air grew thin and cold. Snow began to appear on the peaks above them. The path narrowed to a thread of possibility against the infinite white. One by one, the Pandavas began to fall. First Draupadi, then Sahadeva, then Nakula, then Arjuna, then Bhima. Each one stumbled and collapsed, unable to continue, and Yudhishthira did not stop to help them. He understood that each fall was a consequence of some imperfection, some attachment, some unresolved karma. To try to save them would only delay their progress to whatever awaited. Finally, only Yudhishthira and the dog remained. They climbed until they reached the peak of Mount Meru, the axis of the universe, the mountain that connects all the worlds. And there, waiting for them, was a chariot from heaven, ready to carry Yudhishthira to the realm of the gods. But the charioteer said the dog could not come. Dogs were impure, unworthy of heaven. Yudhishthira would have to leave his companion behind. Yudhishthira refused. "This dog has followed me faithfully through everything," he said. "It trusted me. I will not abandon it, even for the sake of heaven." At those words the dog transformed. It had been Dharma himself, the god of righteousness, Yudhishthira's own divine father, testing his son one final time. Yudhishthira had passed. His commitment to loyalty and compassion was absolute, even when paradise itself was at stake. Yudhishthira was carried to heaven, but what he found there disturbed him. His enemies, the Kauravas, were enjoying the pleasures of paradise, while his brothers and Draupadi were suffering in hell. He demanded an explanation. The gods told him that the Kauravas had earned their place in heaven through their deaths in righteous battle. They had fought for what they believed was theirs, even if they were wrong, and the warrior who dies facing his enemy receives a warrior's reward. The Pandavas, meanwhile, were paying for their sins before they could enter heaven. The deceptions they had used to win the war, the lies, the broken rules, all of these required purification. Yudhishthira said he would stay with his family, even in hell, rather than enjoy heaven without them. This final act of solidarity, of putting love above personal reward, was his greatest triumph. It proved that his Dharma was not about rules and regulations, but about relationship, about care, about the willingness to share in the suffering of those he loved. At that moment, the illusion dissolved. Hell vanished. The Pandavas appeared in their glorified forms, cleansed of all impurity. They were reunited, never to be separated again. And Yudhishthira understood that the final test had been the hardest of all, and he had passed it, the eternal relevance of the Mahabharata. And so we come to the end of our journey. Though the Mahabharata itself has no true end, it continues to live, continues to be told, continues to offer its wisdom to each new generation. The story we have explored tonight is more than 3,000 years old, yet it speaks to concerns that are utterly contemporary. It asks what we owe to our families and what we owe to justice when those two duties conflict. It asks whether there are times when war is necessary and what happens to the soul when we choose violence, even for the best of reasons. It asks what makes a good leader, a good person, a good life. The concept of Dharma, which runs through every page of the epic, has no simple translation. It means duty, righteousness, cosmic order, the law that holds the universe together. Each person has their own Dharma, shaped by their nature, their position in life, their particular circumstances. A king's Dharma is different from a priest's Dharma, which is different from a merchant's Dharma. What is right for one person may be wrong for another. The Pandavas struggled throughout the story to understand their Dharma and to follow it. They often failed. They made compromises. They told lies. They broke rules. They won their war through means that were not entirely honourable. And yet, in the end, they reached heaven, because their intention was always toward the right, even when their execution was flawed. This is a remarkably compassionate vision. It acknowledges that human beings are not perfect, that we live in a world of difficult choices where the right path is not always clear. What matters is not perfection but sincerity, the genuine effort to do what is right even when we are not sure what that is. The Mahabharata history has shaped the culture of India in ways that are impossible to overstate. Its characters are household names. Its verses are quoted in ordinary conversation. Its philosophical teachings inform the deepest spiritual practices of hundreds of millions of people. Temples across India depict scenes from the epic. Dance dramas retell its stories. Parents name their children after its heroes. Beyond India, the Mahabharata spread throughout Southeast Asia, carried by traders and priests and pilgrims. In Indonesia, the epic is performed in shadow puppet theatre, the stories filtered through local traditions and beliefs. In Thailand, the characters appear in classical dance and literature. In Cambodia, the walls of Angkor Wat are carved with scenes from the epic, preserving the story in stone for 1,000 years. This relaxing history documentary has only scratched the surface of what the Mahabharata contains. We have not discussed the many subplots and embedded stories. We have not explored the philosophical debates in their full complexity. We have not met all the characters who populate this vast narrative world. A lifetime of study would not exhaust its riches, but perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you carry with you something of its spirit. The understanding that life is complicated, that our choices have consequences, that even in our darkest moments we can reach for something higher. The awareness that we are all connected, that our actions ripple outward in ways we cannot predict, that the family we are born into shapes us but does not determine us. The Mahabharata teaches that Dharma is subtle. It cannot be reduced to simple rules. Each situation requires fresh seeing, fresh thinking, fresh commitment. The person who clings rigidly to one understanding of duty will eventually be confronted with a situation that demands flexibility. The person who has no principles at all will be lost in the chaos of competing desires. The middle path, the path of wisdom, requires both commitment to values and openness to circumstances. The ancient Indian mythology preserved in the Mahabharata is not a collection of stories about gods and monsters, though it contains such stories. It is a meditation on what it means to be human, to live in time, to face death, to love and lose and struggle and hope. The gods themselves are involved in human affairs, not as distant observers but as participants, because the human drama matters even to the divine. As you settle deeper into rest, let the names and events we have discussed blend into a soft tapestry of sound and image. Hastinapura, with its white walls and lotus pools. The forest where the exiles wandered, full of peacocks and sages. The battlefield of Kurukshetra, now quiet, now covered with flowers instead of bodies. The snowy peaks of the Himalayas where the brothers made their final ascent. These places exist still, in the landscape of India and in the landscape of the imagination. Pilgrims visit them every year, walking the paths that the Pandavas walked, bathing in the rivers where they bathed, praying at the temples that mark the sites of ancient events. The story is not over because it is still being lived, still being remembered, still being told, and you, listening in the darkness of your own room in your own time, are now part of this chain of transmission. The words that began as sound 3,000 years ago have reached you across the vast distances of history and geography. You have received what generations of teachers and students preserved. You are, in this moment, a keeper of the story. Let that thought comfort you as you drift into sleep. You are not alone. You are connected to everyone who has ever heard these tales, everyone who has ever pondered the mysteries of Dharma, everyone who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered about justice and fate and the purpose of human life. The Mahabharata does not end with answers. It ends with questions, with the recognition that the deepest truths cannot be spoken directly but must be approached through story, through metaphor, through the slow accumulation of wisdom over time. The reader who finishes the epic is not supposed to feel that everything has been explained. They are supposed to feel that everything is still possible, that the great questions remain open, that the journey of understanding is a journey without end. This is the gift of the ancient poets. They did not give us certainty. They gave us something better. They gave us a way of thinking about uncertainty, a way of living with doubt, a way of finding meaning in the midst of confusion. They showed us characters who struggled with the same problems we struggle with, who made mistakes and tried to do better, who loved and lost and kept going anyway. Let their wisdom settle into you like a blessing. Let the soft rhythm of these words carry you toward rest. Let the great story of the Bharatas become a dream, a vision of ancient times when the world was young and the gods walked among mortals and the meaning of life was something to be discovered through action and contemplation and the long patience of the heart, the wisdom of the ages. In the deepest hours of the night, when the boundaries between waking and dreaming grow soft, the old stories come alive in a special way. They are no longer words on a page or sounds in the air. They become spaces we can enter, worlds we can inhabit, mirrors reflecting aspects of ourselves we had forgotten. The Pandavas are not historical figures in any simple sense. They may have been based on real people who lived long ago, or they may have been created whole by the poetic imagination. It does not matter. What matters is that they represent something true about human nature, about the struggles we all face, about the choices that define who we become. Yudhishthira represents the part of us that wants to be good, that knows right from wrong, that suffers when we fail to live up to our ideals. Bhima represents our strength, our capacity for righteous anger, our willingness to protect those we love. Arjuna represents our skill, our dedication, our ability to achieve excellence through practice and focus. Nakula and Sahadeva represent the supporting virtues, the quiet competence that makes everything else possible. And Draupadi represents the feminine principle, the power that holds the family together, the fire that will not be dishonored, the voice that demands justice when all others fall silent. Together, they form a complete picture of the human soul in its complexity. We are all of them, in different proportions, in different moments. Sometimes we are Yudhishthira, paralyzed by moral uncertainty. Sometimes we are Bhima, ready to smash everything that threatens us. Sometimes we are Arjuna, focused so intently on our goal that we cannot see anything else. Sometimes we are the twins, doing the essential work that no one notices. And sometimes we are Draupadi, wounded and fierce, refusing to accept injustice. The Kauravas, too, are part of us. Duryodhana is our ambition, our pride, our unwillingness to share what we consider ours. His brothers are the 100 small resentments and jealousies that crowd our hearts. We would like to think we have no Duryodhana within us, but the ancient poets knew better. They knew that the capacity for good and evil exists in every human being, and that the battlefield of Kurukshetra is ultimately internal, a conflict between the best and worst parts of ourselves. This sleep story history has been an attempt to bring you into contact with these ancient energies, to let them work on you while you rest, to plant seeds that may flower in unexpected ways. The Mahabharata is not just a story to be heard once and then forgotten. It is a resource to be returned to again and again, each time revealing new layers of meaning. Perhaps tomorrow, or next week, or next year, you will find yourself facing a difficult choice. You will wonder what is the right thing to do. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a scene from tonight's story will surface. You will remember how Yudhishthira struggled with truth and deception. You will remember how Arjuna overcame his despair through Krishna's teaching. You will remember how the Pandavas endured their exile with dignity and emerged stronger. These memories are not just entertainment, they are guidance. They are the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who faced the same struggles you face and found ways through. The ancient poets who composed the Mahabharata understood that stories have power. They knew that the human mind thinks in narratives, that we understand our lives as stories we are living. By giving us the greatest story ever told, they gave us a template for understanding our own experience, a vocabulary for talking about the things that matter most, a set of examples to follow or avoid. May this vocabulary be useful to you. May these examples illuminate your path. May the blessing of the ancient sages, who first spoke these words in forest clearings while the peacocks called and the breeze stirred the leaves, descend upon you now as you rest. The night is deep, the stars are ancient, the story is eternal. The sounds of ancient India. Let us pause here in the quiet to imagine the soundscape of the world we have been exploring. Sound was central to the ancient Indian experience, and understanding what the characters of the Mahabharata heard can deepen our connection to their world. In the palace of Hastinapura, the mornings began with the sound of conch shells being blown to wake the household. The deep, resonant call echoed through the corridors, bouncing off stone walls and penetrating even the innermost chambers. Servants would stir, beginning the elaborate rituals of preparing food, drawing water, lighting fires. The courts were filled with music throughout the day. Singers performed the ancient songs, accompanying themselves on the veena, a stringed instrument whose tones could bring listeners to tears or ecstasy. Drummers kept time on the mridangam, their complex rhythms creating a mathematical web of sound. Flutes wove melodies through the percussion, imitating the calls of birds and the murmur of rivers. In the training grounds where the princes practiced, the sounds were different, but equally distinctive. The twang of bowstrings being released, the thud of arrows striking their targets, the clash of swords and the grunt of wrestlers, the thunder of horses' hooves and the trumpeting of elephants, Drona's voice calling out instructions, corrections, praise. In the forest, where the Pandavas spent their long exile, sound took on new dimensions. The pre-dawn chorus of birds, a symphony that began before light and continued until the sun was fully risen. The rustle of monkeys in the canopy crashing through branches, chattering to each other in their mysterious language. The buzz of insects, constant and hypnotic, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ashrams of the sages had their own acoustic signature. The rhythmic chanting of Vedic hymns, repeated over and over until the words lost their meaning and became pure vibration. The crackling of sacrificial fires, the soft conversation of teachers and students discussing philosophy under the trees. The silence, too, was a sound in these places, a silence so profound that it seemed to have texture and weight. And on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, the sounds were terrible. War cries in 100 languages, the screams of the wounded, the roar of flames, the crash of chariots colliding, the wet sound of weapons striking flesh. And then, after each day's fighting, the silence of the night, broken only by the moans of the dying and the howling of jackals drawn by the smell of blood. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine these sounds fading into the background, becoming softer and more distant, until they merge with the ordinary sounds of your own environment. The humming of appliances, the distant traffic, the breathing of those who share your home. All sounds are connected, all part of the great vibration that the ancient sages called Om, the primordial sound from which the universe was born. The tastes and scents of the epic. The world of the Mahabharata was rich with sensory experience, and smell and taste were no exceptions. The ancient Indians developed elaborate cuisines and perfumery, and these arts are woven throughout the epic. In the palaces, the air was thick with sandalwood smoke, burned in braziers to purify and perfume the rooms. Jasmine garlands hung from columns and were draped around the necks of guests. Musk and camphor were mixed into oils that were rubbed into the skin after bathing. The scent of ghee, clarified butter used in cooking and religious rituals, permeated every kitchen and temple. The royal feasts described in the Mahabharata were legendary. Dozens of dishes would be served, each more elaborate than the last. Rice cooked with saffron and raisins, curries of lamb and goat flavoured with ginger and black pepper, vegetables stewed in coconut milk, fresh fruits picked at the peak of ripeness, sweets made with milk and sugar, shaped into intricate forms and covered with edible silver. In contrast, the forest diet of the exiled Pandavas was simple but nourishing. Wild fruits and roots, honey found in hollow trees, the occasional deer hunted by Arjuna's unerring arrows. The sages they encountered taught them which plants were edible and which were medicinal, knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years of forest living. There is a touching moment in the epic when Draupadi, reflecting on her changed circumstances, remembers the elaborate meals she used to serve to guests in Indraprastha. Now, she says, she has nothing to offer visitors, not even a cup of water. This lament speaks to the profound disruption of the exile, the loss not just of wealth but of the ability to fulfill the basic duties of hospitality. The scent of the battlefield is not described in detail in the epic, and perhaps that is a mercy. But we can imagine it. The smell of horses and elephants, the metallic tang of blood, the smoke of fires that burned both the living and the dead, the decay that began even before the fighting stopped. It is no wonder that the Pandavas were haunted by the war. Some smells never leave us. The visual splendour of the ancient world. The Mahabharata is a visual feast, filled with descriptions of colours, textures and forms that bring the ancient world vividly to life. The clothing of the period was elaborate and meaningful. Kings wore silks dyed in colours that indicated their status, deep purples and bright yellows reserved for royalty. Their ornaments were made of gold studded with rubies and emeralds, sapphires and pearls. Crowns were tall and intricately worked, topped with peacock feathers or the plumes of other exotic birds. Women's attire was equally splendid. Draupadi is described as wearing a sari of the finest silk, its border heavy with gold thread. Her hair was decorated with flowers and jewelled pins. Her wrists were covered with bangles, and her ankles with bells that chimed softly as she walked. The architecture of the period combined grandeur with spiritual symbolism. Temples were built in the shape of mountains, reaching toward the heavens. Palaces were designed to maximize coolness in the hot climate, with open courtyards, reflecting pools, and thick walls that blocked the sun. Every surface was decorated, carved with images of gods and demons, animals and plants, scenes from myths and legends. The palace of Indraprastha, built by the demon architect Maya, was particularly remarkable. Its floors were made of crystal that reflected like mirrors. Its pools were covered with lotus petals that made the water invisible. Its walls were painted with scenes so lifelike that visitors could not tell where reality ended and illusion began. The battlefield itself had a terrible beauty. The armies arrayed in formation, their banners flying in colours that identified each contingent, the elephants with their armoured heads and painted faces, the chariots gleaming in the sunlight. Even destruction can be beautiful if beauty is measured by the skill and care that went into its creation, the touch of the sacred. In the world of the Mahabharata, the sacred was not abstract but tangible. It could be felt in the water of the Ganges, which was said to wash away all sins. It could be felt in the fire of the sacrifice, which carried offerings to the gods. It could be felt in the embrace of a loved one, which was itself a form of worship. The characters of the epic lived in constant physical relationship with the divine. They bathed in sacred rivers, feeling the cool water rush against their skin. They sat before sacrificial fires, feeling the heat on their faces and the smoke in their eyes. They prostrated before teachers and elders, touching their feet in gestures of respect and receiving blessings in return. The forests where the Pandavas wandered were full of sacred groves where the trees themselves were objects of worship. Pilgrims would tie threads around their trunks, making wishes and prayers. The rough bark against their palms was a point of contact with something ancient and powerful. On the battlefield, the physical sensations were more brutal but no less meaningful. The weight of armour, the strain of muscles drawing a bow, the impact of weapons, the final, intimate contact of death, when the soul separated from the body and began its journey to whatever awaited. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, you might become aware of the physical sensations of your own body, the weight of blankets, the softness of pillows, the gentle pressure of the mattress against your back. These too are forms of contact with reality, with the physical world that the ancient poets celebrated even as they looked beyond it. A final meditation. The lamps are being extinguished now in the palace of Hastinapura. The guards are making their final rounds. The elephants in the royal stables are settling into sleep, their great sides rising and falling with slow breath. The stars appear one by one over the plains of northern India, the same stars that shine over you tonight, wherever you are, whatever time it may be in your corner of the world. In the forest ashrams, the sages have completed their evening prayers. They sit in silence, watching the fire die down to embers. The young students have spread their mats on the ground and are drifting towards sleep, their heads full of the verses they have been memorizing all day. The trees stand like silent guardians, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. On the banks of the Ganges, pilgrims have placed small oil lamps on leaf boats and set them floating on the water. The river carries them downstream, a procession of tiny lights against the darkness. Each lamp is a prayer, a hope, a memory of someone loved and lost. The water gurgles softly, eternal and indifferent, carrying its burden of faith toward the sea. In the Himalayas, where the Pandavas made their final journey, snow is falling on peaks that no human eye can see. The silence there is absolute, the kind of silence that the sages called the voice of God. The air is so thin that breathing becomes meditation, each inhalation a reminder of the gift of life. And somewhere, in every time and every place, the story is being told again. A grandmother whispers it to a sleepy child. A scholar puzzles over an ancient manuscript. An actor brings a character to life on stage. A listener, not unlike yourself, lets the words wash over them as they drift toward dreams. The Mahabharata is not just a story. It is a living presence, a companion for the journey of life. It has been here before you were born, and it will be here after you are gone. To hear it, even once, is to become part of something larger than yourself, something that stretches across time and space, connecting you to everyone who has ever wondered about the meaning of existence. May you sleep well. May your dreams be gentle. May you wake refreshed, carrying something of this ancient story with you into your day. The Mahabharata is ended, and the Mahabharata continues, as it has for 3,000 years, as it will for 3,000 more. In the telling and the listening, in the questioning and the wondering, in the eternal human effort to understand what we are doing here and how we should live. Rest now. The story will be here when you return. Here, in the final moments before silence, let us simply breathe together, in and out, slow and deep. The rhythm that connects us to every living thing, to every human who has ever lived, to the Pandavas themselves who breathed this same air 3,000 years ago on the plains of India. Breath by breath we release the tension of the day. Breath by breath we soften into the present moment. Breath by breath we let go of the past and the future and simply rest in what is. The chariot wheels have stopped turning. The conch shells have fallen silent. The warriors have laid down their weapons and gone home to whatever home means for each of them. The battlefield is empty now, covered with wildflowers and the songs of birds. And you too can lay down your weapons, whatever form they take in your life. You can release the battles you have been fighting, the arguments you have been rehearsing, the worries you have been carrying. Not forever, just for now, just for this night. Tomorrow they will still be there if you need them. But tonight you can rest. The great tale of the Bharatas has been told. The princes have found their heaven. The kingdom has passed to new hands. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. And through it all, the one constant is the telling, the listening, the ancient compact between speaker and hearer, storyteller and audience, voice and silence. I have told you a story. You have listened. We are connected now, across whatever distance separates us, by the invisible thread of narrative. May that thread hold as you dream. May the characters we have met walk through your sleeping mind, showing you things you need to see, teaching you things you need to learn. May the great river of story carry you gently through the night and deposit you safely on the shores of morning. Sleep, dream, rest. The Mahabharata watches over you until we meet again in story. Good night.